We begin Chapter 8 by defining air masses. Now, what we mean by an air mass is an extremely large body of air whose temperature and humidity are similar both horizontally and vertically. Now, consider this figure here. We have a high pressure system in the southeastern United States. Take a look at these temperatures here. These temperatures are all in Fahrenheit. Miami is 43, Jacksonville 27. Coastal-wise, fairly warm still, but otherwise very cold. Again, these temperatures are in Fahrenheit. These temperatures are extremely cold for these regions. And so we have a mass of air, cold air, that has moved from the north to the southeast. So we have this cold and dry air mass. Now, how do we know it's dry? Take a look at the dew point. That's the second number here. Miami is 39. Jacksonville is 18. So Miami, its dew point's still fairly high, but everywhere else, your dew point in Fahrenheit is quite low, often in the negative numbers. Now, when we describe an air mass, we need to talk about its source region. That means the area where the air mass originates and where it comes from. So, since an air mass is a body of air whose temperature and humidity are similar, those are the two properties we use to actually classify an air mass. And the classification of humidity also tells us a little bit more about the source region of the air mass. Humidity, the two classifications are maritime or continental. Maritime meaning it comes from the water, from the ocean or a sea or a lake, somewhere around there. And continental means it comes from the continent or the land. Temperature, the three different classifications are tropical, meaning hot, Arctic, meaning really cold, and polar, meaning just somewhere in between, generally cool but not necessarily cold. So to do our classification, we give it both a humidity and a temperature. For example, if I say it's from the Gulf of Mexico, where it is warm and moist, then I call it maritime tropical, and I give it the abbreviation MT, which describes warm, moist, and usually unstable air. Now, if I have a cold air mass, a really cold air mass that comes from the continent, dry, then it will be continental Arctic. If it's cold but not too cold, then I'd be more continental polar. Do you get the idea here? You combine the humidity along with the temperature to describe the classification of the air mass. Now, is it possible to have one air mass that changes? Yes, it is. Here's an example of what we call a modified continental polar air mass. Again, continental polar means it's dry and cool, so probably from Canadian region, somewhere around there. Came from the north, and in this example, here's your cold, dry air, came from the north to the southeast, and now is passing over the water. As it does that, it picks up water and becomes more moist, and so it has now become modified. Now, here is a satellite loop that I grabbed from a few years ago, showing this actual modification. You can see right here in this region a lot of clouds forming, moving from the north to the south. That is our continental polar air mass that has moved over the water and picked up water and become modified and become more humid. So there's a good example of a modified continental polar air mass. Now, we see this often in a topic we discuss as lake effect snow. You have continental polar air mass that moves over an unfrozen lake, and then as it moves over the lake, it evaporates, it picks up some of the evaporated warm water from the lake. And then when it reaches the cold land on the other side of the lake, it cools that air. The air can no longer hold the water. It drops it all in the form of snow. This often happens on the eastern side of lakes. So here's a picture of the Great Lakes. The regions highlighted in white are regions that are commonly known for snowfall due to this lake effect snow. Here's another example of an air mass. This is a maritime polar air mass. It's coming from the sea. It's from the north, so it's colder, so it's maritime polar, coming onto land somewhere around California, bringing, of course, lots of snowfall, sometimes rain, thunderstorms. It varies from one air mass to another. But this too can be modified. As the maritime polar air hits the land, it'll hit the Olympic Mountains in Washington State, cause a little bit of rainfall as the air lifts and condenses. But then on the leeward side of the mountains over here, the air is descending, the clouds will disappear, you'll get no rainfall, so you get what's called a rain shadow. And then after that, it hits the Cascade Mountains, which are a little bit higher, causing a little more cloud formation, more rain, and then when it reaches the other side of the Cascade Mountains, the air descends, and so doesn't form clouds, and the air is now even drier, having left even more rain behind. And so you get another rain shadow on the leeward side of the Cascade Mountains. And I want to note here is a region, the same region where Death Valley, the Great Basin in the west, where they often occur. So this is a very common phenomenon in the western states. And then one more time, we hit that now modified maritime polar air mass hits the Rocky Mountains, rises up, and you get a lot of showers. And now you've got even less air. So you have an even more modified dry Pacific air mass. So it's a modified maritime polar air mass. So in summary, we have 5 basic types of air masses that are defined by both temperature and humidity. If it's humid, that means it's coming from some body of water. We call it a maritime air mass. If it's dry, generally means it's coming from a land mass. That will give it a continental category. If it's warm, it's a tropical air mass. If it's cold, it's an Arctic air mass. And then if it's cool but not super cold, it's a polar air mass. One last point to end with. Notice there is no maritime Arctic air mass. Maritime Arctic does not exist. Why? Because when you're that cold, you're going to have the least amount of water in the air, because being cold, it can't hold as much water. And so you'll never get an Arctic air mass that is extremely humid, because as soon as it moves anywhere else into the polar regions, it's going to be dry because it just can't hold as much water. Final point, these are your 5 basic air masses: continental Arctic, continental polar, continental tropical, maritime polar, maritime tropical, and all 5 of these air masses can be modified as they move to different regions.